Okay, this is part 10F, and we're doing yet another thing that you're supposed to do with Scripture, checking context. We just looked at the context of Romans 10:1 through 8 to show how to read Romans 10:9 and 10, and what we found out was that Paul is actually saying the opposite thing from what Christians say. Paul is saying that mouthing it is not enough, because the Jews were very busy mouthing the law, mouthing the law, mouthing the law, but they weren't believing in it, so they weren't saved. Now that has really been Paul's theme throughout the book of Romans, because the Romans were having the same problem as the Jews. The Romans were very busy with their pious observances, but they weren't believing. Now they were saved, but after salvation it's the same issue as to get saved. You have to believe. All the obediences and the works don't count. You have to believe. And so the Jews were very busy, and they're very famous for it even to this day. But even back, when Paul was writing in the first century, and he should know he was Jewish, they were very busy with their works and their observances and the punctiliar observance of the Mosaic law. They were famous for that. But the trouble is that going with all that outer body activity and mouthing, every Saturday, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, they're very good at that. Okay, but they weren't believing it in their hearts. They had it memorized by heart. They were mouthing it. They were confessing to the law, but they weren't believing in it, and therefore they weren't saved. So that was Paul's theme from the beginning. And just so that you can tell that was, I've got up on screen here, we're going to start here in Romans 10:11. All right, anyone who believes, the word trust there in the NIV is really the word believe. It's the exact same word as in John 3:16. The one believing in him will never be put to shame. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, as you can see, it's talking about the prophecy to the Gentiles, that God called not only from the Jews but also the Gentiles. And that's in Romans 9:24. So I want you to see that Paul is paralleling himself from the larger context of not just Romans 10:1 through 8, but ever since Romans 9, because he's continuing to build on the points he made earlier in the book of Romans. Now I want to focus on first of all, our context, our real context, starts at verse 24, because he's getting to anyone who trusts in him will never be put ashamed in the left-hand side of the screen, Romans 10:11, as a result of building from here in Romans 9:24, because it says right here, I will call them my people who are not my people. I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. That's a prophecy about the Gentiles in Hosea. Okay, and then you are my people, you are not my people. That was another part of it. In other words, he's going to call the Gentiles out from the Jews. All right, and that's what Paul is calling himself. He's an apostle to the Gentiles. So he's reminding them that right here in Romans 10:11 and 12. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is the Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. Now that's where Paul's going to get really interesting. But first, I want to make sure you understand that the context has to do with this verse right here. Okay, see, we're coming up on Romans 10 on the right-hand side of the screen. What shall we say? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness. In other words, they weren't in the law. They have obtained it. That was his big theme in Romans 1 through 4. They got a righteousness by faith. But Israel, who pursued the law, tzav l'tzav, constantly confessing to the law, constantly mouthing it, they pursued the law of righteousness, but they didn't have it. Why not? Here we go. Because they didn't pursue it by faith. That is the same thing as we saw in Romans 10:9 and 10. And belief. Romans 10:9. Why not? Why didn't the Jews get it? Because they didn't pursue it not by faith, but by works. See, when you mouth something, that's you doing it. That's works. All right? Even if you admit Jesus is Lord, which he really is, whether you admit it or not, you're doing something with your mouth. But believing in him in this case, expressed as God raised him from the dead, that's based on his merit, not yours. That's not works. Believing is not works. All right? The Gentiles obtain righteousness by what? Faith. Believing in him. See the parallel? On the right-hand side, Romans 9:30. On the left-hand side, Romans 10:9. Okay? Anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. So you see how 10:9 brackets what you do with your heart and get justified. And of course we saw that this part of the NIV is mistranslated. With the mouth you confess to salvation is the corrected translation. So if you're confessing to salvation, anyone who trusts in him believes. The word trust is really believes. It's pisteon. In the Greek it's a participle. Anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Okay? Israel was not doing that. Israel was pursuing a law of righteousness. They were confessing with their mouth. They didn't do the righteousness which is by faith, and that's why Paul says, and believe. So you see, he's threading through the point he made in 9:30, all the way down here to Romans 10:9. And then he repeats it again quoting actually several passages in the Old Testament. He's concatenating them. Anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. He's quoting Jeremiah 17:7, Isaiah 49:23 in particular, and he's also quoting himself right here in Romans 9:33. Same word, shame. See? So the point of you seeing this now is to understand that this context right here that we're all talking about, the people saying that you have to say it aloud to be saved, they're reversing what Paul is saying. Paul is saying that Israel was doing the mouthing. We just saw that in Romans 10:8. The word is in your mouth, but they're not believing in it. So that's why he adds this and believe. Because they were pursuing a law of righteousness, have not attained it. Why? Because they didn't pursue it by faith. They weren't doing the and believe in the left-hand side of the screen. They were doing their works. Confess with your mouth is works. So they stumbled over the stumbling stone, Christ. Anyone who trusts in him will not be put to shame. So he's again going back here. This is the most important verse he's quoting. That's in Isaiah. Okay, it's a very famous verse. Let's see if I can tell you what one it is. Should be Isaiah 20, let's see, 8. I think it's Isaiah 8. Let's see. There. And Isaiah 28:16. That's the particular one. Disturbed is not a good word. Okay. It's disturbed, dismayed, those aren't good enough. Those are he's talking about being undone. Okay, karaiskuno, which Paul is actually using that word here in Romans 10:11. See? Well, we can get to 10:11. Okay, see, same word, karaiskuno.